The cake was almond, white, dense, and sickly sweet. It clung to the roof of her mouth as she chewed in silence, each bite a quiet rebellion against the sirens echoing outside. The kitchen clock ticked like a gavel. 2:14 p.m. Just hours ago, they had cut this very cake together, hands entwined, faces smeared with icing and hope. Now, he was in handcuffs, and she was alone with a plate full of lies. Outside the kitchen door, voices clashed, detectives gathering statements, lawyers shouting over each other, her mother sobbing in the hallway. But here, in this small pocket of stillness, she picked at the frosting and thought about the man who'd sworn he'd love her forever. He had looked so sincere. He had said all the right things. He had known just how much her father's inheritance was worth. She ran her finger along the rim of her wine glass and tried to remember the exact moment love had turned into leverage. Maybe it was the day he insisted on merging bank accounts, or the night she found a second phone tucked in the glove box like a confession. They would say she should have known. Maybe she had. Maybe knowing and admitting are different things. Either way, the vows were real to her. The trust was real. And now the betrayal was too. In the courtroom, they'd argue over dates, signatures, intent. But here, surrounded by the ruins of a wedding reception, only one thing was certain. She had loved him. He had loved the money. The ceremony was held under a tent the size of a cathedral, its white fabric trembling in the ocean breeze. Strings of crystal chandeliers hung like glass constellations, refracting light across tables dressed in imported linen and flower arrangements that smelled like wealth. Heady, cultivated, impossible to ignore. A quartet played Vivaldi as the guests, dressed in silk and secrets, sipped champagne with the practiced ease of people used to being catered to. It was the kind of wedding that made headlines and silenced doubts. Jasmine Monroe walked down the aisle like she owned the world. And maybe she did. Her dress shimmered with custom beadwork from a Parisian atelier. Her veil floated behind her like smoke. She didn't smile, not fully. Just that cool, polished curve of the lips that said she was aware of every camera, every guest, every whisper. She was elegance incarnate, controlled, untouchable. And when she reached the altar, she leaned in to adjust his boutonniere, with the same care someone might use to rearrange a painting, just enough to correct the narrative. Her mother, Miriam, sat front row in Chanel, her posture so upright it looked painful. She didn't cry. Her eyes flicked between the guests instead, cataloging reactions, ranking them like stock tickers. Her approval, like her fortune, was never given, only traded. Dorian Jasmine's father clapped him on the shoulder with a politician's grip, firm, rehearsed, and without warmth. He was already 3 glasses of scotch in, his laughter just a shade too loud, his stories just a hair too sharp. "You've done well," he said, but it sounded like a warning. They all had that same smile, that family smile, thin, gleaming, and cold. As the ceremony unfolded, the protagonist, James, stood beneath the weight of silk canopies and stifled truths, his mouth moving through vows like they were lines from a play he'd only half rehearsed. Jasmine's fingers in his felt like ice through velvet. Beautiful, measured, dangerous. After the applause and the kiss, as they were ushered to the reception by handlers in black earpieces, he caught a glimpse of Miriam whispering something to the wedding planner. A moment later, the maid of honor's toast was cut from the schedule. Jasmine didn't react. She didn't need to. Control had already been assumed. He had thought marrying Jasmine would be the beginning of love, of family, of stability. But standing there, surrounded by legacy china and hedge fund heirs, it hit him. This wasn't a wedding. It was an acquisition. He hadn't joined a family. He had been absorbed into one. And Jasmine? Jasmine hadn't married a man. She had married a silhouette her family could sculpt. And he hadn't married a woman. He had married a dynasty. It started small. Everything dangerous does. 3 months before the wedding, Jasmine called him from a boutique in Tribeca, laughing as she held up a pair of shoes on FaceTime. "They're only $1,200, she said. "You want your fiancé to look amazing at the engagement party, right?" She didn't wait for an answer. The charge appeared on his card an hour later. He told himself it was a one-off, a gesture of love, a harmless indulgence. He could afford it. Sort of. Then came the wedding gifts. My parents think it would be more tasteful if we upgraded our registry, Jasmine had said over dinner, stirring her risotto without looking up. Waterford, Hermes. Not that crate and barrel stuff. She smiled at him then, the kind of smile that made it feel less like a demand and more like a dream they were chasing together. Next came the emergency transfer for Miriam's silent auction, $5,000 for a rare bottle of wine no one would ever drink. It's just easier if we handle it for her, Jasmine had murmured, curling into him on the couch, slipping her hand beneath his shirt as she guided his finger across her phone to authorize the wire. Your family now. Eventually, Jasmine suggested consolidating their finances. It's silly to keep two separate accounts. What's mine is yours, she said with that same disarming grin. But what was his slowly, quietly became theirs, and what was hers somehow remained untouched. Every transaction felt reasonable in isolation, a gift here, a favor there. But together, they became a tide. One he didn't realize was pulling him under until he looked up and saw how far he drifted. He didn't speak up. Not then. Not when the monthly credit card bills ballooned. Not when Jasmine casually handed his banking info to her family accountant for tax stuff. Not when Dorian suggested he leave his job at the ad agency to explore something more ambitious with capital from the Monroe Family Trust. He told himself it was love. That compromises were part of building a life together. That Jasmine would do the same for him if the roles were reversed. He convinced himself that her family wasn't condescending. They were just old money. And this was how old money operated. Polished, quiet, entitled. He felt guilt too. Guilt for not being born into this world. Guilt for not having more to offer. Guilt for sometimes feeling like a guest in his own marriage. And beyond all that, there was hope. That one day, he'd belong here. That one day, it would all make sense. But over time, the hope began to rot around the edges. One morning, while reviewing their bank statements, he noticed a wire transfer he didn't authorize. $8,000 to a trust in Miriam's name. When he asked Jasmine, she laughed. You said to handle the gala expenses, remember? He hadn't. But he didn't press. He just nodded and let it pass, the way he had with everything else. Later that night, he stood alone in the walk-in closet, staring at a row of designer heels lined up like trophies, tags still on most of them. His reflection blinked back at him from the mirrored wall, smaller than he remembered. He had believed he was building a future, but the foundation was never theirs. It was hers, her family's, their name, their rules. And slowly, irreversibly, he began to wonder. Had he fallen in love with Jasmine, or had he just been conditioned to feel lucky she ever looked his way? It took months, quiet, deliberate months. He started small, screenshotting account statements, forwarding emails to a burner inbox, taking photos of documents Jasmine left on the kitchen island, assuming he never looked. At night, when she was out at charity galas or dinner with Miriam, he'd sit in the dim light of the guest bedroom, sorting through bank transfers, legal documents, and password-protected files she hadn't bothered to hide well enough. The deeper he dug, the more patterns emerged, money shuffled between shell accounts, purchases made in his name for things he'd never seen, loans co-signed without consent. Miriam's signature appeared too often. Dorian's connections filled in the rest. Jasmine's fingerprints were everywhere. He didn't confront her. He didn't yell or accuse or demand. That would only invite gaslighting, the Monroe specialty. Instead, he documented. Quietly. Ruthlessly. Then, one gray morning, before she returned from a weekend wellness retreat, he placed a sealed envelope on the desk in the guest bedroom. A single word written on the front in his cleanest handwriting. Truth. Inside was everything. Copies of bank records, email threads, a USB drive labeled with the date he found her secret account, and a letter. Not emotional, not accusatory, just facts. A timeline, a trail. He didn't leave it for her, he left it for himself. A line in the sand, a record of the moment he stopped doubting his instincts. No more pleading, no more justifications, no more waiting for her to change. That envelope was a quiet rebellion, not a warning, a decision. The call came just after noon. James was on his third cup of coffee, watching rain paint streaks down the kitchen window when his phone lit up with a number he didn't recognize. He almost ignored it. But something in his gut, something sharpened by months of silence, made him answer. "Mr. Ward?" The voice on the line was clipped, authoritative. "This is Detective Briggs, Financial Crimes Unit. I believe you've been expecting this." He didn't speak, just let the silence fill the space between them. "We're bringing in Jasmine Monroe and her parents today. We have enough to proceed formally. Video evidence of forged documents, access logs tied to your accounts, paper trails connecting multiple fraudulent transactions to their family trust." James gripped the edge of the counter. "What kind of evidence?" he asked, finally. Briggs didn't hesitate. "Your financial data cross-referenced with activity on 3 shadow accounts, 2 of which were created using credentials from your old firm. There's security footage of Miriam accessing your office, and Jasmine—" He paused, then added, "We have her on a recorded call saying, 'He's my husband. His money is mine. That's the deal.'" The words hit like a final verdict, not a surprise, but a confirmation. James didn't rage, didn't flinch. He exhaled slowly, his hand steady, as he lowered the phone. "Thank you, Detective," he said. "Let me know what you need from me." After he hung up, he poured himself a glass of scotch, one of the only things in the house that was truly his, and walked into the guest bedroom. The envelope still sat where he left it, untouched, silent. He didn't smile, but something in his chest loosened. Not closure, control. They had called it love. The court would call it fraud. But for the first time, he called it what it really was. Over. And this time, he wasn't the one being fooled. The email was short. Subject: "You don't know me, but we should talk." From Malik Monroe Body: "I think you've been through what I saw happen to someone else. Jasmine's ex. His name was Derek. Call me, please." At first, James stared at it, unsure whether it was a trap. Another Monroe move, another attempt to stay ahead of the storm. But Malik wasn't one of them. Not really. He had always lingered at the edges of family functions, polite but distant. Too quiet for Dorian's taste, too principled for Miriam's. He hadn't been at the wedding. Curiosity won. They met in a quiet cafe in Brooklyn, far from the marble and glass aesthetic of Monroe power lunches. Malik arrived wearing a hoodie and jeans, carrying a battered laptop bag. He looked nervous, but resolved. "I've kept quiet for a long time," Malik said as they sat down, "because that's what this family expects. Silence, loyalty. Pretend you didn't see what you saw." But Jasmine, she did the same thing to someone else. Years ago, a guy named Derek. James leaned in. Engaged in 2019. Derek was a software engineer, bright, generous, quiet guy. Thought he'd won the lottery with Jasmine. Same pattern, lavish gifts, pressure to merge finances, constant family emergencies. By the time he pulled away, they'd drained his crypto wallet and ruined his credit. He tried to go public, but no one believed him. The Monroes shut it down fast. Malik slid a flash drive across the table. "I saved this before the family wiped his accounts. Group chats, screenshots, digital receipts. Derek sent it to me before he disappeared. Said if anything happened to him, someone had to know." James hesitated, then took the drive. It felt heavier than it should have. "I've been carrying this around for years," Malik said quietly, "waiting for the right person, the right moment." Back at his apartment, James plugged the drive in. It was all there. Text threads with Jasmine demanding loyalty after Derek refused to take out a loan in his name. Group messages between Miriam and Dorian, strategizing how to handle him, like a liability, not a person. Screenshots of Jasmine mocking Derek to her friends, calling him naive but useful. And the receipts, cryptic deposits into Monroe's shell accounts just days after Derek's assets disappeared. James sat back, the hum of the laptop filling the room. He felt sick, not from betrayal, but from recognition. It was the same script, different man. And suddenly, the shame he had carried for months didn't feel so singular. The way he had doubted his instincts, questioned his worth, apologized for feeling uneasy. He wasn't the first. He had just been the next. For the first time, he felt seen. He wasn't crazy. He wasn't weak. He was part of a pattern. And that meant exposing it wasn't just about justice for himself. It was about ending it before someone else became the next Derek. It started with Sarah. She wasn't a lawyer. Just a meticulous, fire-hearted analyst James had met during a financial ethics workshop years ago. He remembered her knack for finding patterns others missed, and more importantly, her ability to care without pity. When he called, she didn't hesitate. "You give me the data. I'll give you the story they don't want told," she said. Together, they built the scaffolding of a case. She combed through the flash drive Malik had given him, cross-referencing every transaction with public records, trust filings, and shell companies tied to the Monroe family. James pulled in his own documentation, statements, screenshots, the sealed envelope from the guest room. They met late at night in cafes, traded encrypted emails, and stored everything in a cloud drive labeled simply restitution. Then the emails started. First from a woman in Chicago, Lena, who had been engaged to Dorian's nephew. Then a man from Miami who'd been involved with Miriam's sister. Slowly, steadily, the circle widened. Different names, different cities, but the same story. Seduction followed by financial entanglement, control masked as care, and silent devastation. Some had never spoken out. Others had tried and been buried by non-disclosure agreements or smear campaigns. Sarah organized everything into a growing timeline, color-coded by victim, location, and method. James watched in awe as the dots on the map connected like constellation lines, revealing a sprawling, deliberate operation beneath the surface of Monroe affluence. What had seemed like personal betrayal now looked like policy. Tactics passed down, refined, and deployed with surgical precision. They weren't dealing with a single con. They were unraveling a legacy built on it. James noticed the shift one afternoon, staring at a wall of printed documents in Sarah's home office. What used to feel like shame, his shame, was now fuel. He wasn't just a victim anymore. He was a witness, a whistleblower, a builder of reckoning. "I used to think this was about her," he said quietly, reading an email thread from Lena's case. Sarah didn't look up. "It's not about her. It's about what they've gotten away with." They prepared the evidence for prosecution. Sarah coordinated with law enforcement contacts. Malik reached out to Derek's last known employer and found him willing to speak. Slowly, the picture took shape. Fraudulent signatures, coerced financial authorizations, even charitable donations used as laundering mechanisms under the guise of philanthropy. Each file, each name added to the growing archive made James feel a little lighter, a little less haunted, because now the truth was no longer a secret in an envelope. It was a case, a reckoning, a movement. And for the first time, he wasn't standing alone. The courtroom smelled like old wood and cold air. James sat in the front row, hands folded in his lap, heart pounding slow and steady like a war drum muffled beneath layers of civility. The gallery was sparse. Only a few journalists, a scattering of former associates pretending not to be invested, and two women from the victims' group seated quietly in the back. Jasmine entered in a navy suit, minimal makeup, no jewelry, no smile. For a moment, she looked like a stranger, until she turned her head slightly, just enough for James to catch that flicker of calculation in her eyes. Not fear, not regret, just surprise that this was happening at all. The trial began with procedural calm, the kind that belied what was at stake. The defense leaned hard on spousal privilege, painting the financial transactions as misunderstandings between newlyweds. "A marriage built on trust," the attorney said smoothly, "perhaps misplaced, but not criminal." But the prosecution was quiet thunder. Sarah's timeline and the flash drive from Malik laid the foundation. Dozens of coordinated financial maneuvers traced across 4 states, paper trails woven through the Monroe family trust like rot beneath polished floorboards. One by one, digital receipts, false authorizations, and manipulated emails were projected for the jury to see. They weren't just isolated errors. They were evidence of intention. The final blow came from a recovered group chat Jasmine thought was deleted. One line, in particular, projected on the screen, bold and chilling in its simplicity. "He'll never leave. He thinks love means debt." Classic money mule. A hush fell over the room. The jury stared. One woman pressed her hand to her mouth. The judge called for a short recess, but the damage was done. The lie had shape now, texture, a digital fingerprint. When court resumed, Jasmine didn't look at James, not once. Her composure remained, but the cracks showed. The way her knuckles whitened around a glass of water. The way her attorney leaned in to explain basic QQ. Her composure remained, but the cracks showed. The way her knuckles whitened around a glass of water. The way her attorney leaned in to explain basic questions, as if she no longer understood the rules of a world she once controlled with surgical precision. James sat still, calm, not vindictive, just steady, not watching her, but witnessing her. He had no need to confront her. The evidence was doing that for him. The verdict came 2 days later. Guilty, on 2 counts of financial coercion and 1 count of fraud, downgraded in exchange for cooperation on broader Monroe investigations. The courtroom buzzed with barely contained murmurs as the sentence was read. 5 years probation. Full restitution to all named victims. Mandatory financial ethics program. No contact order issued for James Ward and all victims. Not jail. But no more hiding either. Jasmine stood still as the judge delivered the terms, her face blank except for a single twitch just at the corner of her mouth. Not sorrow, disbelief. As if she couldn't quite comprehend that control, her currency of choice, was gone. Afterward, James stepped outside alone. The sky was pale with winter, breath rising in front of him in soft plumes. No applause, no catharsis. Just silence and air and the strange weightlessness of truth fully revealed. A reporter asked if he had a comment. He paused, then said only, "She didn't lose. She got caught." Then he walked away. Not with closure, but with clarity. The courtroom had spoken, and finally, so had he. James didn't celebrate. He didn't toast the verdict or post a statement. He didn't give interviews or tweet clever takeaways. He let the silence do what it needed to do, settle the dust, breathe in the truth, and speak louder than revenge ever could. Justice had already spoken. Anything more would feel like performance. The restitution money arrived 2 weeks later, a wire transfer from a frozen Monroe fund authorized by the court. It sat in his account for all of 12 hours before he moved it, every last cent, into a foundation for victims of financial abuse. He named it the Derrick Fund, quietly, without announcement. Not because he wanted to be noble, but because he didn't want the money to live in his life any longer than it had to. It wasn't his. It never had been. He moved out of the apartment soon after. Too many echoes there. Too much architecture shaped around someone else's expectations. The walk-in closet still smelled faintly of jasmine perfume, an irony not lost on him. The walls remembered things he wanted to forget. His new place was smaller. Sunlight came in through wide, honest windows. No secrets. Some nights were still hard. He'd lie awake, sifting through memories, wondering where he could have stepped off the path sooner. But gradually, the weight started to shift. Less like shame, more like scar tissue. Something tender, but closed. He began to reclaim himself in pieces. Music he liked without explaining why. Food without compromise. Long walks without agenda. He saw friends again, slowly. Real ones. The kind who didn't ask for favors wrapped in flattery. He read a book cover to cover without thinking about what Jasmine would have said about it. Then, one afternoon, a letter arrived. No return address, but the handwriting was unmistakable. He sat with it for a long time before opening it. Jasmine's voice, preserved in ink, was as cold and polished as ever. "You always misunderstood me. You always needed to feel like a victim. Maybe this is how you win, by turning your own weakness into a story people believe. I trusted you. You turned it into betrayal. No apology, no ownership. Just blame. Smooth, weaponized blame, crafted like everything else she touched." James didn't finish reading. He folded the letter back along its seams, walked to the kitchen, and fed it through the shredder. No fire, no drama, just the soft, mechanical hum of something ending. Closure wasn't dramatic, he realized. It didn't need speeches or revenge. It was a quiet, deliberate act, a choice. That letter was her last attempt to reclaim the narrative. But the difference now was that he no longer needed to respond. He'd already said what needed to be said by walking away. And this time, he didn't look back. James moved in with Belle a month after the trial. It wasn't a dramatic decision, more like a quiet landing after an exhausting fall. Belle's apartment was modest but warm, filled with the scent of herbs she grew on her windowsill and the soft hum of a life lived without pretense. There were no expectations, no questions about what came next, just the steady comfort of her presence, the kind that felt more like a reset button than a rescue. She didn't ask about the past, didn't need to. Instead, they spent nights talking about everything else: books, movies, long-forgotten family stories, and lazy mornings where nothing was expected. For the first time in what felt like forever, James could simply exist without always looking over his shoulder, waiting for something to crumble again. It was during one of these slow mornings that he met Omari. He'd come over to meet Belle for coffee, a nonprofit worker who specialized in helping people who had survived financial and emotional abuse. His work focused largely on men, a group often overlooked in this kind of trauma, and he spoke with a quiet intensity that felt familiar to James. "There's a silence around this kind of abuse," Omari said, after James had shared a little about his own experience, "especially for men. We're told to man up or tough it out, but that doesn't heal anything. It just keeps the wounds hidden." James was struck by how effortlessly Omari spoke about things he'd never dared to name aloud: his shame, his guilt about staying so long, the small compromises that had chipped away at his sense of self, suddenly felt less isolating. The stories Omari shared about other men who had faced similar patterns of manipulation and control hit too close to home. There were other victims, and they were speaking out. Finally, Omari encouraged James to share his story. Not for revenge, not for recognition, but for healing, for those who still think they're alone. At first, James hesitated. What could he possibly add to the growing conversation? But after weeks of reflection and late-night talks with Belle, he realized that his voice wasn't just a tool for personal healing. It could be a bridge for others. Slowly, he began sharing his story publicly. At first, in small ways: a local support group, a blog post, a guest appearance on a podcast. Every time he spoke, more survivors reached out to thank him, telling their own tales of hidden pain. He learned that the silence surrounding financial abuse, especially among men, was far deeper than he ever imagined. But the more they spoke, the more they gave permission for others to do the same. He wasn't just reclaiming his life anymore. He was helping others do the same. 1 year later, James stood in front of the mirror, the soft glow of early morning light filtering through the blinds. He hadn't looked at himself this closely in ages. The man staring back at him didn't look like the one who had been suffocated by fear, by guilt, by love, twisted into control. He looked whole again. He had learned to forgive himself, not for what he had allowed to happen, but for the time he had spent hating himself for it. He had learned that rebuilding a life wasn't about finding the perfect version of himself. It was about taking the fractured pieces and accepting them as part of the whole. The man in the mirror now reflected someone who was no longer broken, but stronger for the cracks. The news broke that day, late in the afternoon. Civil suits had been filed by more victims of the Monroe family's financial manipulation. James had known it was coming. Word had spread through the network of survivors. But seeing it in print, hearing the names, seeing Jasmine's face on the screen again, it felt different this time. She couldn't close the door she'd opened. As the news cycle churned, James took a deep breath and turned away from the mirror. The court of public opinion had its verdict, and soon enough the world would know what had been hidden. But he wasn't part of that game anymore. "They took my money," he thought, as he closed the door behind him, his reflection fading into the hallway. "But I took back my voice, and that was priceless."